evening all. Welcome to the next webinar of TiE Mumbai. And it's also in partnership with 100x VC today. It's an honor and a privilege to have India's top 3 leading tax experts. They never come on a panel together, but for TiE Mumbai, they've done that. And thanks to 100x VC for that. Without further ado, let me introduce today's anchor for the talk on tax and regulatory for angel tax, Yagnesh. As you all know, Yagnesh is more an TiE in-house CFO, and he does part-time work with 100x VC as their CFO and co-founder. Yagnesh has been a career finance and corporate strategist. He's worked with the Hinduja Group. He's also been part of Atul Ruvia's Phoenix Mills Entertainment World. He's also been part of Mahesh Tutorials, which is now a part of SL Group. And more importantly, he's also been a partner with Bessemer Venture Partners. Without further ado, Yagnesh, it's your day, it's your story, it's your platform. Over to you.
Well, thanks Naveen. Thanks for welcoming, and I thank all the TiE members for allowing us this opportunity to bring together a discussion which is could not be more relevant in these circumstances today. So I would like to jump on to introducing our panelists for today. Brilliant list. I'm feeling so proud to introduce all of them. Firstly, I introduce Mr. Dinesh Kanabar, CEO of Dhruva Advisors LLP. We don't need to really introduce Dinesh Bhai, but for the sake of process, Dinesh Bhai is a very senior visionary in the tax practice. Dinesh Bhai has been winner of Asia Tax Practice Leader for last year 2020, a stalwart in the industry, and has over decades been recognized by his peers as among the top tax advisors in the country. His ability to relate the business strategies of clients to tax and regulatory environment has been recognized as unique and has played a critical role in developing solutions for clients. Dinesh Bhai is a qualified chartered accountant and a fellow member of the Institute. Prior to founding Dhruva, he held a series of leadership positions across several large professional service organizations in India. He's also a member of National Executive Committee of FICCI and currently a mentor of the FICCI Committee on Taxation. He's also worked with the Government of India on several policy initiatives and was a member of the Rangachari Committee. Welcome Dinesh Bhai to today's session.
Thank you.
Next on our panel is Mr. Gautam Mehra, partner PwC. I worked with Gautam Bhai earlier in my Hinduja days. Gautam Bhai has joined PwC as a partner in September 2003. Since then has held various roles in the firm. He was the India tax and regulatory leader between July 2015 to December 20, prior to which he was leading PwC's tax and regulatory practice in Western India and the Financial Services Tax and Regulatory Group. He was also the asset management sector leader for PwC in India. He presently leads the PwC global relationship for one of the India's largest conglomerates. Over the years, Gautam has been working with multinational and domestic clients across a wide spectrum of services and has had varied experience of 30 years spanning multiple sectors. Prior to joining PwC, he had stints with 2 leading accounting and tax consulting firms, which was followed by a long association of over 12 years with an independent practice founded by him. Gautam is currently a board member of the India chapter of APREA, a regional real estate industry body. He has been a member of SEBI's Alternative Investment Policy Advisory Committee, as well as the National Direct Tax Committee of the CII. He was also a member with the American Chamber of Commerce, as well as of the Expert Advisory Committee of the ICAI. Gautam holds a postgraduate degree in law and financial management and is also a member of the ICAI. Welcome Gautam to the session.
Thanks Yagnesh for those kind words, and best wishes to you and everybody for continued safety.
Thank you so much, Gautam. And we have, last but not the least, Mr. Hitesh Gajaria, the senior partner at KPMG India, has over 36 years of professional experience in the fields of tax, transfer pricing, and regulatory consulting. Hitesh Bhai is a senior partner at KPMG in India, having led the firm's tax and regulatory services practice from 2018 to 2020. He had earlier also led firm's transfer pricing practice and was tax leader of the firm's industrial and consumer markets vertical. Hitesh is sought after for his professional insight and counsel on tax and regulatory issues and trends in India. Hitesh is a regular conference host, presenter, and moderator at various international tax and transfer pricing conferences in India and overseas. He's been regularly featured in the international and Indian media, newspapers, and business magazines, where he is asked to speak, contribute, comment on various business and tax issues. Hitesh Bhai has also co-authored BCAS publications on taxation, FERA, FEMA, transfer pricing manual, and multilateral instrument, a compendium, and was a country reporter for India at the International Fiscal Association's conference. Also, he has a passion for singing, I'm told, and has interest in personal finance. Hitesh has also advised clients across sectors, especially pharma, hospitality, shipping, transport and logistics, IT and consumer goods, on various tax, transfer pricing, and regulatory issues. These span across cross-border structuring, JVs, foreign collaborations, regulatory compliances, and supply chain management. He carries specialized knowledge and experience of Indian FERA, FEMA regulations, and in obtaining regulatory approvals. He's also a visiting faculty at the RBI's Bankers Training College for over 12 years and has graduated from Jamnalal Bajaj Institute of Management Studies. Welcome, Hitesh Bhai, for this session, and thankful to you.
Thank you, Yagnesh, for those kind words. Let's start the conference.
Sure. So, with that, introductions, let's just jump on to our main session. Today's session, we were contemplating as to, which are the audience that we are wanting to target, which is the relevant industry that we want to target. And there was absolutely, uniformity in terms of the opinion. Just to give you a little bit of context, guys, today, India's vision of a 5 trillion economy would not be possible without growing the startup ecosystem. We all are aware about the growing startup ecosystem in the country. We've seen very, very active participation recently from a lot of angel investors, overseas investors, family offices have now come forward, started to invest in startups, and that is exactly what is triggering this whole startup ecosystem 2.0 wave that we call, right? The first wave happened between 2010 to 2020. We are now seeing the second wave, and that's exactly why we thought that today's session was especially meant for angel investors, investors across from India, investing overseas, as well as a lot of NRIs and global investors wanting to invest in India. So there is a combination of outbound and inbound investments, and hence this was a topic that we felt very relevant to be bringing today to all of you, so that we can discuss inbound related provisions, outbound related provisions, some of the DTA, double taxation avoidance agreements. There's this whole new thing about AIFs and gift cities provisions that have now come in. So we'll touch upon all of that, guys. Let me just kick off the discussion with one general question. As we see, a lot of interest has been generated around angel investing. And in the government in May 2018 had given angel tax relief to startup investors. Now there has been a little bit of a lack of clarity around what exactly are the benefits. So starting with Hitesh Bhai, if you can give us more clarity about the exact nature of the exemptions, removal of the angel tax, and so on and so forth that we've seen, which has benefited angel investors. So if you could just throw more light on that, we can kick off the discussion.
So, well, the clarification that the government gave was that a startup company, which means a private company either incorporated under the Companies Act 2013 or even earlier in the Companies Act 1956, but which is recognized as such in accordance with notification GSR 127E dated 19 February 2019, which was issued by the DPIIT Ministry of Commerce and Industry. So long as that startup was recognized as such by the DPIIT, then it would not suffer the consequences of the angel tax. But to my mind, again, in a sense, that was a little bit too late and too little. Quite frankly, let's understand what was the abuse that was sought to be cured. The abuse was that there were rumors that some operators were trying to rig losses by, or let's say convert black money to white by capital infusions, etc. And I thought the remedy lay in actually going after those individual cases to really find out who are the persons behind the perpetration of such abuses, and not bringing such a, let's say, wide section change from which came in, I think, from 2013 or 14, where 56(2)(7) and 56(2)(10) were made so vast as to actually try and catch everybody who then unfortunately were in this situation till this particular clarification came out, who had to justify each and every capital infusion transaction as not having been their own income, which I thought is a little bit of a strange thing in a country where otherwise we have a democracy, because in a democracy and in a country where rule of law prevails, it is the unless you are proved guilty, you are always deemed to be innocent. But here, with this sweeping change, it in a sense gave a message that you are guilty and now you have to prove your innocence. So it worked the other way around, and which put a lot of startups into considerable difficulty in that twilight area or of time when this clarification was not there.
So just to kind of add on to this, going to Gautam again here. So the exemption that was given, how has that benefited angel investors now going forward? Let's say post 2018-19. What are the benefits that angel investors can seek when they invest in startups?
Yagnesh, I think Hitesh has put this out very well. The relief that was given to a identified small segment of the population, and as he rightly said, guilty unless proven innocent. Right? India tax law does have general anti-avoidance rules, right? And one could have very well, gone to those to catch those specific perpetrators, rather than having a sweeping change and putting the onus on the taxpayer, so to say, to justify. So yes, the relief has come, but it's come to that narrow segment. One is aware in multiple transactions of genuine difficulties faced by investors as a result of this ruling. The IBC set of transactions are a classic example of this. Right? So rather than having a whole sweeping gamut of applicability and then trying to carve out, it's probably better to have a more specific provision which tries to address the mischief, so to say.
Sure. So, going to Dinesh sir, one question that comes to my mind is that there has been a lot of this talk about Indians investing abroad right now, in a situation where we are seeing some companies in India initially registering in India, but then going back to either a Delaware or any other jurisdiction to start a US entity, though the business may be conducted in India. And as a result, Indian investors end up investing overseas. So help us with understanding those nuances. What are some of the important things that Indian investors should take care of when they're investing abroad? What are the tax implications? What are the processes? Kindly guide us on that, Dinesh.
Yagnesh, two things, the way you put it is a company set up overseas and then sort of flipping the structure really is a situation where it's not the company which is making the investment, but really the shareholders in the company then wanting to have their investment into an overseas holding company as opposed to an Indian holding company. And this has been a subject matter of immense controversy, a lot of tweeting with nationalistic sentiments being put up, etc., etc. And if I may dare say, Yagnesh, the general perception is that all of this is done for the purpose of taxes. Whereas in my personal experience, I have seen people want to flip structure for a variety of commercial reasons, whether it is the ability to attract overseas investment in a better way, whether it is wanting to list overseas. Of course, Indian valuations themselves have been very, very rich, but then there are certain segments where overseas listing at a particular point of time could be considered to be far more advantageous. Or for example, you want to raise debt, and that becomes very much easy overseas compared to an ECB regulation, etc., the ability to hedge, etc. So there are a number of reasons why people would want to choose an overseas structure. And also, Yagnesh, one has seen that apart from investment, one could also be looking really as to how do you operate structurally. Is Indian company the entrepreneur? Is the overseas company the entrepreneur? An Indian company merely executing the contracts, etc. It's a subject in itself, and I'm sure as we go along, we'll talk a lot about it. But if I may dare say, the single largest issue which has come to haunt anybody wanting to do this is the subject of round tripping. And what is round tripping? We don't have a definition. We have the new 9th August 21 guidelines, which we'll talk about as we go along. But a subject in itself, and probably a much maligned subject, where regulations which have nothing to do with commerce and regulations which have nothing to do with taxation are really sought to be used here. I think that the very fact that you need to go to the Reserve Bank to seek an permission, and then finally, to a situation where even if you have an overseas structure which is not investing into India, where the funds going from India are not coming back, also could be regarded as a legal round tripping versus an economic round tripping. It's a nightmare which is sought to be put into place without really having any good commercial justification.
No, I think you fairly put that, Dinesh bhai. So, and a follow-up question to that is, some of our investors, like we run a Cat 1 fund. What happens is, as per RBI guidelines, Indian investors are allowed under the LRS guidelines to invest abroad, whatever that limit is, about $250,000 in overseas companies. But AIFs have to now go and take permission, for every investment single. So just wanted to pick your brains on, is it really the right way to do it? Is it hampering Indian AIFs investing abroad? Some of the thoughts would be welcome because we have some of the AIFs also here as the audience. So would love to know your perspective there.
I think at the heart of your question are two specific issues. One is that are LRS investments subsumed into ODI or not, or are they a separate regime? And two separate views emerging out there. So that's one thing, and I'll come to that in a moment. And the second issue which comes up there is the regulation on financial services, which is a bane for the government really to come back and say, if your investment is into financial services sector, then you need to obtain approval from a regulator, be it SEBI, be it Reserve Bank of India. And if you look at both these issues, Yagnesh, look at the first aspect. The point really is LRS subsumed into ODI? And if you say that it is really, then are you going to govern the investments which are made under LRS route with the same restrictions which are covered by ODI? And again, there is a lack of clarity. We have seen authorized dealers not really take a consistent view, and there is no emerging guideline. And assuming for a moment that you were to subsume LRS within ODI, which I don't think is a correct approach at all, how do you make investment, for example, in instruments other than equity? So for example, if you have to make investment in preference shares, you can't do that at all, and therefore would you not want to apply LRS regulations? So that whole sort of segment of issues that we need to consider. And then going back to investment in financial services, and even assuming that we are looking at an ODI and we are looking at investment in financial services, an absolute no-no, even for a negligible quantum, you need to obtain approval from your regulator, be it SEBI if you are under SEBI, or from Reserve Bank of India. An interesting set of issues coming in, because the approach which SEBI has been taking and the approach which RBI have been taking are not necessarily consistent. RBI tends to be far more micromanaging, going into depth of all the applications. Whereas if you are a SEBI regulated entity, like for example, a sub broker or whatever, you could get permission to make overseas investments far more easier. Sort of the lack of consistency and all of that, each issues on which again a lot can be spoken about.
Yeah, well, that's exactly, we were just trying to, like in a recent case, I'll just share with you, we were trying to invest in an overseas company, and we had just to invest about $10,000 or $20,000. And we were told by our lawyers that you have to apply to SEBI because we are an AIF. It really sounded funny that, you for an amount of $20,000, we have to go and wait for SEBI, and then, umpteen number of meetings. And nowadays it's all online, right? You can't even go to a SEBI office and talk to them. All these resolution happens online. So took us a little bit of time to invest, but I mean, it did come through. So that was the whole.
Yagnesh, a point there,
Yeah.
that the recent draft regulations, and they're yet to be finalized on 9th August 21, probably in some senses helpful, still contains a bit of lack of clarity. But for example, the issue on round tripping, which has been the bane for the entire outbound community, probably sets to rest to say that round tripping is not at all a problem, so long as an overseas investment is not made for the purposes of tax avoidance. Now, two set of issues come in. The first set of issues is how will it be determined whether an investment overseas is for tax purposes or not? Clearly, there may be a tax deferral. So, for example, you may make investment into a Singapore company, and the Singapore company may disinvest, and there may be no tax in Singapore on capital gains. But then obviously when you get the money back into the country, it's liable to tax. And again, the rates could be different, etc., etc. Would you call this deferral of tax a tax evasion, not call? How will an AD look at it? Is an AD going to come back and ask you for self-certification? And what if you were to self-certify and later on the view came across that you were indulging in tax evasion? How would that be regarded? Would a AD come back and say, get me a chartered accountant certificate, and can a chartered accountant even certify something like this? And then again, in an earlier context, both Hitesh and Gautam spoke about the overreach of regulation. So you have GAR, which is already there in tax, which takes care of whatever is required to be. Do you now need a GAR under exchange controlled regulations? So we are looking at all of those issues. And then we have an other set of issues. Again, you spoke earlier, for example, about $250,000 limit, etc., etc. I'm sure Gautam, when he deals with the subject of ISFC, will deal with it far more in detail. But that subsumes even an investment in ISFC. And then again, in the new guidelines, ODI versus OPI, portfolio investments continues to be a gray area. Number of representations have been made, and I'm hopeful that Reserve Bank will hear some of them. And but the fact that the Reserve Bank has chosen to put the new guidelines and is sort of burying the ghost of round tripping, which actually should be monitored by the ED or whatever else, it is really a very, very welcome step.
Yeah, I think that's something of a welcome news in the draft guidelines. Let's see if the draft guidelines, clear more confusion than create some. But coming to Hitesh Bhai, we are seeing a lot of this whole spate of investors wanting to invest in India, right? And most of them are here on this particular gathering also. So I'd like to just ask you, what are the different modes of investment that foreign investors can invest into Indian startups? And are there any relaxations provided under the foreign investment guidelines for investment by NRIs? So if you could just throw some light on that.
Sure. So you raise a very important point, and definitely I think India is one of the hottest markets, let's say, not only in terms of the market itself that it presents for startups, but also in terms of the sheer talent that is available, this ecosystem that is today available, let's say, to the startups to scale up, etc., in terms of pure linkages with the other like-minded people is mind-boggling. And I think therefore India has rightly come up the startup value chain very, very quickly. Now, when one is considering inbound investments, well, there are well-defined routes of investment. The most common one being the foreign direct investment. And the important nuance to that is the investment under FDI via the convertible note. And I will deal with a little more in detail little later on this. Then obviously there is foreign venture capital investment. There are AIFs. There are rupee denominated bonds. There is investment on non-repatriation basis, which NRIs and persons of Indian origins and their overseas corporate bodies can avail. And then there is the external commercial borrowings, which in a sense is a kind of a borrowing, not really a investment in that sense. Now, generally, what I have seen in my experience is that startup companies, when they are wanting to attract foreign investment into India, normally choose to avail either the foreign direct investment or the FDI scheme, or they choose in the FDI that special convertible note scheme. Now, what is that? The advantage of a convertible note for a startup is that the exact valuation at which these convertible notes will be converted to equity shares is deferred till the point of time at conversion. Whereas, let's see, under the FDI, even if you have a compulsorily convertible instrument, say a compulsorily convertible debenture or a compulsorily convertible preference shares, their conversion is compulsory, and the conversion price has to be locked in as per the minimum valuation norms on the date of the issue itself. Now, this therefore gives convertible note a extra advantage over other forms of foreign direct investment. Secondly, even in case of transfer of shares, there is a provision for payment of deferred consideration. It is 25% of the value upfront and the balance in 18 months, which regime itself can be more relevant for a startup. And partly paid up shares issues is also relevant for startup. Then, moreover, the external commercial borrowing schemes for notified startups is also a little more flexible than the normal ECBs that are prevalent. Now, generally, the FDI regime and the startup FDI regime does not differ too much, except, as I said, the convertible note. And this is an instrument actually, and let me deal with it in a little more detail. Convertible note is an instrument which is issued by a startup company, which acknowledges the receipt of money initially as debt, which is repayable at the option of the holder, that is the lender, or which is also convertible into such number of equity shares of that startup company within a period not exceeding 5 years from the date of issue of the convertible note, upon the occurrence of specified events and as per the terms and conditions which may be agreed upfront by the investee company and the investors. So these are broadly the various routes which foreign investors can use to invest in startups in India.
Well, that was pretty exhaustive, very, very useful information for all our investors today. And just as a pause here, audience, please keep posting your questions on the chat box, because after our round of discussions, we are going to take up those questions. So, and please wait for that, because we are going to have some topics covered, and then we'll obviously, if it is not covered under our questions already, we are going to take that up later in the session. So please keep posting those questions on the chat box.
Also, Yagnesh, there's a request that if all the speakers could come a little closer to the mic, that will be helpful.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Naveen. So, thanks for that, Hitesh Bhai, and I'll also have some follow-on questions on that as well. But moving on to Gautam Bhai for a minute, Gautam bhai, this is a question related to the much talked about recent initiative by the government on the IFSC, which Dinesh bhai briefly mentioned. Would like to get your thoughts on some of the IFSC regulations that can be simply explained to overseas investors wanting to invest in India, or for that matter, Indian investors wanting to invest offshore. Is IFSC guidelines helpful, or if so, what is it? How do you look at it? What are the benefits? If you could kindly articulate, Gautam.
Sure, sure. Thanks, Jagdish. And you probably, for the benefit of viewers, I may clarify that in 2019, the IFSC Authority Act was kind of put in place. This is a physical area in the state of Gujarat, which is, like a special economic zone. Very interestingly, for the purpose of exchange control regulations, this is treated as being outside India. But for the purpose of income tax, it is treated as being in India. Just putting it very simple in plain, simple language. A very exciting and interesting development, specifically from the point of the audience over here, which are investors. And let me talk first for investors who are investing from outside into India. The whole alternate investment fund regime, which is now set up and handled by the IFSC authority, not by SEBI, that's the local authority over there. That regime is fairly liberal compared to the Indian AIF regime. So for example, if you were to invest in an Indian alternate investment fund, there would be investment diversification norms. You can't invest more than 25% in a particular entity. There are restrictions on leverage. You cannot have segregated portfolios for co-investment. Now the IFSC and a fund set up under this regime does not have investment diversification restrictions. There are no limits on leverage. All of this is to be agreed mutually, disclosed in the PBN and agreed with the investors. And you can have segregated portfolios for co-investment. So these are more the commercial aspects. So much so that even existing funds which are set up in Mauritius for the purpose of investing into India, the tax laws have been relaxed to permit a relocation of those funds into GIFT City. And being fairly tax neutral. So you don't have to pay any tax on as a result of transfer of investments, etc. There was talk about the outbound investments. So obviously this is money coming from offshore into an AIF over there and free to be invested offshore without any approvals, because it's money not, from an exchange control perspective, crossing the India borders. So that's the additional degree of flexibility that's there. From a tax perspective, also, I think they've done a fairly good job. An AIF over there, I'm talking of a category 1, category 2, not the listed and derivatives and hedge space. It's a pass-through, tax pass-through. The very important point in a tax pass-through vehicle of this kind for investors is that you are more likely to get the credit of tax paid in India on exits back in your home country for a set-off against taxes in your home country. Coupled with the advantage of saying that you don't have to necessarily file a tax return in India or even obtain a permanent account tax number in India if you don't have any other income from India. So you're getting the benefits without having to go through the compliance obligations. So that's a big difference. And foreign investors who are coming to India for the first time, generally there's this thing of I don't know what this is about, and I'd rather wait and stuff like that. For the Indian investors, obviously, who are going there, it's under LRS. The NSE over there has kind of notified that they will be coming out with depository receipts, investment of US or overseas companies. So you could buy a portion of Apple stock or Google stock, which will then be, there'll be a market making happening and stuff like that. So it's just making it a little more simpler for Indian investors to invest outbound through this. But of course, LRS limits would continue to apply there. Interestingly, if you are an asset manager, there are a host of exemptions on the management side. So your fees, there's a 10-year tax holiday out of the first 15 years. Yagnesh, you may be aware of the latest ruling on GST on carried interest that's shaken up the asset management world. So if you are able to demonstrate substance and kind of relocate and set up the fund in IFSC, that's another hurdle you could cross and a pain point you don't have to necessarily think about. So I'll pause, but a whole host of advantages of going through GIFT City. We're already seeing a lot of fund managers setting up base there, and apart from fund managers, banks, insurance companies, leasing companies for that matter, and now the GIFT City authorities have also permitted ITS operations to a limited extent over there. So lots of activity. The road looks good ahead.
No, that's brilliant. The recent GST one that you just mentioned, Gautam, is a big needle mover for a lot of fund managers. There's a lot of buzz around all of us in the CFO PE group to kind of start evaluating, setting it up in the GIFT City, and then utilizing those benefits. So I think that's very useful information on the AIF side. But just to kind of part on that last one small question, how much time does it take to kind of set it up? In terms of timelines, cost, some of our investors who are interested in investing in Indian startups would want to know how much time can they expect to get this whole setup done if they choose to do so, and if so, what is the cost involved in setting up an entity in the IFSC? So if you could just give us some pointers there.
So if I could compare it with an investor wanting to set up a structure, say in a Mauritius or Singapore as in the past, or an Indian asset manager wanting to set up a similar structure in India under the AIF regulations. This is faster, and it's definitely not more uneconomical. You've got to rent an office space there, definitely. You've got to have people on the ground there. But the process with the IFSC authority, they are quite proactive and pretty open. So our experience has been good there. To the extent an Indian asset manager has to do a sponsor contribution into that, you will need the RBI approval. That's the piece which may take time, but you just park that aside, and if you have some time to put in your sponsor contribution, post the approval, setup of the structure by itself is fairly quick and efficient.
Sure. And that really helps, because I'm told that we had a presentation from the GIFT City guys, and they said, we are pretty prompt. We'll get it all done in a month, 2 months time. But I was just thought it was too good to be true. So let me just check with you on that one. Just coming back to Dinesh Bhai, one question for you in terms of, you just mentioned about these proposed guidelines that have come out from RBI on the 9th of August, and a lot of buzz around what's been proposed, what's been not. So I'm just posing one question, and then maybe we can build on it. So that the guidelines seemingly propose to, now allow Indian investors to make portfolio investments only in listed securities. Is this true? What will happen to the prior investments that are made in the overseas VCF structures or MFs? So that's one question that is coming in, but that's just one. But love you to kind of address more questions that are coming out of the guidelines.
Again, as we know, we have the ODI route and the OPI route. I spoke about it to you earlier. And the way the guidelines are currently drafted, they seem to suggest that all that we are looking is ODI route, and we will not look at the OPI route at all, and portfolio investments therefore. But to my knowledge, again, there have been, as I mentioned to you earlier, multiple representations to Reserve Bank of India. And although the date has just gone by for making those representations, already number of dialogues have happened with Reserve Bank of India. And I think there is an acknowledgement by the Reserve Bank of India that this probably is a bit of a slip. And I'm seeing that when the final guidelines come in, probably what we will see is that this restriction will be far more liberal, and we would have the ability to make investments in listed, unlisted securities. To what extent we will go and how will we go, and therefore the current regime of needing that prior approval, etc., to what extent they will relax remains to be seen. But I do not think that the Reserve Bank intends to go ahead with the guideline as currently drafted in a draft form.
Sure, I think that's useful to know, Gautam Bhai, and just thought of one of the questions that might be relevant for all of you. Just wanted to ask you about currently we are talking about a lot of retail participation in startups. Now, are there any suggestions that you guys have in terms of how does one increase retail participation in startups? And currently, obviously any startup who's registered can invite investments into them, and then pretty much this whole exemption about an angel investor having a minimum net worth of 2 crores, having exemption for investing in startups, and clauses around that. So just wanted a thought across the table on how can this be more promoted, more relevant regulations can come across which can promote more retail participation. So any thoughts around that, starting with you, Dinesh bhai?
Why don't we just let Hitesh go in for the domestic investment, and then I will come back on how those regulations can be looked at from an outbound perspective, because equally really, as we look at whether it is flipping of structures or even a setting up of structure overseas, where one is making an investment in a startup by individuals, we have a number of challenges. So I will let Ritesh talk about investment in Indian startups on a retail basis, and then come back on overseas investment.
Thanks a lot. Hitesh bhai, over to you.
Sure. So I think what most investors, especially foreign investors and much more retail investors, want is complete certainty, which has been ever elusive. We've, especially in our tax laws, and less so, I think, in our foreign exchange regulations. Our foreign exchange regulations, thankfully, have only been more and more liberalized. I don't remember, foreign exchange regulations suddenly, springing up nasty surprises for foreign investors, except perhaps, when they somehow suddenly brought that investment into a wholly owned subsidiary outside, as not being under the LRS route or not being a permissible investment. That is one of the things which stands out as something which took everybody by surprise. But otherwise, what most individual investors want is a clarity. And let's say angel investor tax or angel tax was one big problem area. Now the government could have completely wiped that out, could have actually said that, look, this is probably an overreach. It doesn't apply to most situations, but instead they choose to put it through the, let's say, the small little medium of a registered or a recognized startup in DPIIT. Now, it's not as if every startup necessarily is even sure of whether this will take off, not take off, or for them to start, working on the registration with the DPIIT. So I think one of the things that I would root for, and one of the things I have been saying, proclaiming, is, can we have, let's say, a complete pause in all tax regulations? So for example, can we publicly say that, okay, our Income Tax Act 1961 will not change for the next 3 years, or will not change for the next 5 years. Okay, whatever uncertainties are there, we will keep them as they are. We will not try to give clarifications on clarifications, which in fact confuse people even more. If that can be achieved somewhere, then I think all of us will breathe a sigh of relief. Maybe the only startups who are dealing with, let's say, tax law changes or with printing of books or publishing tax journals and magazines, maybe their business will slightly suffer. But every time we cannot have new regulations and new rules and things which continue to muddy the waters. And what, from my perspective, the way I look at it, why should, let's say, an individual startup investor even need to consult chartered accountants? Can it not be made so simple as to say, look, for the next 5 years, so long as you invest in these, laudable ventures, we are not going to come and question your source of funds. We are not going to come and question, let's say, the valuations. We are not going to come and attribute income where there is none. And sure, if they are otherwise to be found abusive, you can have all the strict enforcement that you want. But please don't color the entire environment as being fraudulent till you yourself prove that, no, you are a genuine person. So I think the need of the hour today is certainty, and maybe it's a radical suggestion I'm making, but for 5 years at least, there should be no change in any direct tax laws.
No, I think very well put. I can really relate to this, Hitesh bhai, because I'll just tell you our example, and most of people here would relate to this. We have a separate one-person team here just to help startups in terms of inviting investments from abroad. these guys don't understand what forms to be filed with RBI. If I have to register with DPIT to get income tax benefit, all of that is so difficult for founders to understand. It can be definitely made, a lot of simplicity can come in. But just one question, Nitesh bhai, before I jump on to others. Uh, in terms of the advisory stock, like, there is this concept of advisory stock, which a lot of these foreign investors who bring in a lot of expertise to Indian startups. Let's say a startup wishes to issue advisory stock to a foreign investor who provides management services to startups. Does FEMA permit issuance of such shares to foreign investors? And if so, what are the other things that probably need to be taken care of?
So currently, as I understand, advisory shares are typically a form of a financial reward in the form of stock options, right? That's my understanding of an advisory stock. Now, these are usually given to people who are business people with previous experience as company founders or senior executives or whatever. Now, unfortunately, this concept is not very prevalent in India because we currently only recognize issuance of employee stock options to employees or directors or of holding company or JV company or whatever. We don't have a kind of a situation where somebody, if he's neither a director nor an employee, but he's just, let's say, a mentor or an advisor, can be issued such stocks. And unfortunately, that's a lacuna which perhaps needs to be, let's say, plugged, if you will, because the environment itself is so dynamic and changing. Now, incidentally, again, there is hope because the NDI rules, which is under FEMA, permit Indian companies to issue shares against any permissible payables, let's say, to a non-resident, right? So long as he conforms to the pricing guidelines and due reporting is made by the company. But why can't therefore advisory stock also be a concept which can be discussed maybe with RBI? RBI may well push it to SEBI, but between the regulatory authorities, I think they should come up with things to make this whole concept much more broad than just an ESOP to employees and directors.
So if I could come in, Yagnesh, and talk about the outbound bit and the retail impact. So 2-3 things, Hitesh mentioned about certainty in laws, and that probably is not relevant only to startup, but all of us look to certainty in law. And I think, unfortunately, the way the regulations are drafted, it is always that somebody has abused, and then you are making laws around that specific abuse. And the guy who's abusing might find different ways of abusing, but a lot of others get caught into the whole thing. And this entire proposition on Section 56, deemed income, evaluation is a result of that entire thing. But going to outbound investments and really looking at retail participation in startups, and if they have holdco overseas and whatever else, I think 2-3 things come into play. First is my limit of 250,000 really even sufficient to do what I need to do? And assuming that I'm looking at clubbing the family, that cannot be really done unless each one of them is owner of the shares, and that cannot really be practicable at all. So I think first and foremost, we need to recognize that startups would have possibilities overseas. They may have some part of their operations in India, but there will be a lot of things happening overseas. And we need to seriously relook at our LRS. And again, the point which I made earlier, and I'm not going into it all over again, about this clarification that ODI and LRS limits are separate. And then again, the earlier point which I made is a need for a specific clarification that those limits don't apply to startups if they are in IFSC. So really, those are the things which we need to consider. And then again, Yagnesh, on a sort of a separate thing, when you are making overseas investments, a host of issues come up. The ability to take foreign tax credits, what happens when monies are repatriated in India, and all of these really need to be a lot of thought about and sort of answered.
No, I think very valid point, Dinesh bhai. Very importantly, people come and ask us that, if I get tax deductions done in India, what happens when I'm in the US and I'm filing my returns, and do I get my tax credit? Likewise, the reverse question of Indians investing abroad, and then whether they get full tax credit or is there a leakage? I mean, what in your experience has been the case?
Both questions are very, very valid, Yagnesh. And let's first come to tax credits which India grants. In some sense, India is quite progressive. We have two sections, sections 90 and 91. One which provides that if there is a tax treaty, you get credits, and one which provides a unilateral credit, even if there is no tax treaty, if you have paid taxes overseas. So in that broad sense, it's a very welcome situation. But if you go into practical aspects, a number of issues come in. Let's assume that you are an Indian with an Indian company with operations overseas. What happens to FTCs in respect of state taxes, for example, in the USA? Are you entitled, not entitled? And the general view seems to be that you aren't. But if you aren't, is that foreign state tax really at least an expenditure which is deductible? And we seem to have a significant amount of controversy around that. And then we have situations, for example, that you make an investment into a partnership, for example, in Singapore. And Singapore does not recognize partnership as a non-transparent entity, instead a transparent entity. And a partnership pays taxes through its partners. And when then the income is repatriated into India, you have a separate set of challenges because you may not be able to get credit because the credit overseas is paid by the partners, whereas the income belongs to the partnership firm. And when the partnership firm pays taxes, there are challenges around that. The reverse again is a very interesting situation. So for example, US company investing into India, taxes paid in India, whether you can get credit, and the source rule becomes very, very important. You can get credit only if the income is in respect of an asset source in India. And there are a number of challenges which happen out there as to whether USA would consider a particular asset based out of USA and not in India. So for example, you have indirect transfer rules, and you have Section 9, which continues to apply, which was inserted to take care of Vodafone. Now, you may end up paying taxes in India, but USA may not regard that as taxes paid in respect of an asset situated in India, and might regard it as an asset situated in USA, and therefore you could have double taxes. So again, sort of Yagnesh, a subject in itself, the year of credit, we have issues with regard to tax sparing. So very, very interesting. Many of the tax treaties which India has were signed when India was not really making a lot of investment overseas, but was only inviting overseas investments into India. So take the Indian treaty, for example, with Canada, Australia, UK, where if they invest into India, there is a concept of a tax sparing. So whatever tax is spared in India gets created overseas, but it works one way. And if you get, for example, an R&D exemption overseas because you are an Indian company and the taxes have been spared there, you will not get that credit for those taxes paid in India because the treaties are really one way. So again, a host of things which come out there.
No, absolutely. I think the whole effect of DTA is a big issue for even angel investors to grapple. But I'll kind of come to Gautam now and ask one question that I've been wanting to for example, I mean, there is one question also coming from the people is that what if so obviously we understand the AIF structure, it is a regulated structure under SEBI. How about if there are a bunch of investors wanting to pool funds, as a network? Like we've heard about angel networks, right? Some are registered under AIF, but some are not. So what if there is an angel network is not pooling funds, but directly making investments into startups without collecting the funds themselves? So in that case, do they really qualify to register with SEBI? What would be the advice, Gautam? That's one of the questions also that has been put in the box. So can you throw some light on that?
Yeah, so I think the intent of the regulators is very clear that if there is a pooling of money and that money is being pooled and put in together, then there is a need to register. If Yagnesh, you, Hitesh, Dinesh, and I decide to invest in one startup for a moment, and each of us are investing independently and separately, right? I don't think it would require any registration, although we may be talking to one another, right? And we may be part of, let's say, an angel industry body or so to say, right? But yes, one would have to really go through the facts very carefully. But this is the response that I have. Just even coming back to the question about how do you promote retail participation in angel, right? So you're very well aware the angel funds is there already under category 1, right? One hasn't seen much action over there, right? While overall the size of AIFs has really proliferated over the last 5 years, tremendously, 10x, right? We've not seen that action. And you have an investor net worth of 2 crores, excluding a primary residence. It's just simple basic maths, right? Somebody with 2 crores of net worth, assuming 50% is towards financial assets, right? Assuming 25% of that is towards, if I'll say, slightly more riskier class startups, right? You're talking of 25 lakhs. Well, that's the amount of something that qualifies for an angel fund, right? And but I think the need is to sit down and see why haven't angel funds taken up? What's stopping a pool of angel investors to come and invest? Is it multiple investments to be made, and you may just be coming together for one, and you don't want to do it? So go and modify the regulations to enable that, right? The other piece about we've discussed in the past in some of the bodies is what about crowdfunding, right? And there are pros and cons of that. And the feedback is what happens when whatever doesn't have to hit the fan hits the fan, right? Is the regulators will be called in question to say why didn't you have checks and balances in place? So I think it's an evolving sign of as markets mature. One will have to look at saying, let's go and see if we can modify the angel fund rules. Let's see if crowdfunding can be put together in some shape and form. And while we're only talking about equity, if you go back and look at the APAC First Committee report, we had deliberated on what about non-equity funds being made available. There's a huge gap between availability of funds and the requirement of funds between the borrowers who don't have access to the larger banks and that kind of stuff, right? And there is a concept of a specific vehicle which can be created for this purpose. So stuff like that, I guess one just have to brainstorm and take it forward.
No, I think very valid point, Gautam. I can really relate to this. We've advised people on angel funds, and we see the structure. But just to let you know, there has been an underlying movement in terms of registering angel funds. So I guess the trend is about to change. I guess the initial hesitation was because the angel fund works on a scheme to scheme basis and is slightly, and in my opinion, actually it's much cleaner, right? If you invest in one deal, whichever one that you exit, you just distribute funds to your investors and you're done with it, rather than a VCF structure, which kind of, pulls in the entire investment over a period of time, and it becomes difficult to kind of, repay funds to your LPs after a point of time. So actually it's simpler, but I think there is more transactional documentation, those kind of issues that I think we'll have to deal with in the angel funds. But I think the tide is changing. We are seeing a lot of angel funds getting registered by these so-called private angel networks. And that's a movement that, in my opinion, it will definitely catch up, and you will see some more, guys forming angel funds and getting regulated. And that's the way to kind of have structured investments. So, I'll kind of stop here and just take a little bit of view from the audience here. I think there are some questions, so we'll go ahead and take that, and then start, asking you that question. So the first question that I can see is that, Mr. Kanchan has asked, saying that how will GIFT City help overseas investment into India? And I know you touched upon it, but any other pointers, Gautam, you can take this.
I think the whole intent of this is to really generate a lot of economic activity, especially in a post-COVID world, with the IT/ITES also opening up in GIFT City. Right? While we've been focused on Make in India, I think the whole concept of serve from India in a work from home environment can really be played to India's advantage. And to my mind, the whole SEZ, I'm not just talking of GIFT City, but across, we are seeing them heading towards becoming not fully utilized assets. A few changes, and there's some discussions going on as well. If that can happen and this infrastructure can be leveraged for the purpose of Serve from India, it'll be a fantastic move as far as the country is concerned and the nation is concerned. I did touch upon the other more, I'd say immediate benefits, especially AIFs, how much attractive it is to invest from there. So let's see. We are seeing a lot of action over there.
No, I think that's a valid thing, and I think the regulations are getting more and more favorable, is what I understand from this discussion. Uh, Hitesh bhai, before we move to the questions, just wanted your thoughts on some of the amendments that have taken place in case of tax residency provisions. Uh, you know, in a kind of attempt to tax Indian citizens. However, the tax residency provisions changed because a lot of NRIs are facing this whole tax residency definition. So, any thoughts around that, Hitesh bhai, because that's relevant for some of our audience here. So, would you like to throw some light on that?
So yes, from financial year 2021, there have been now two major changes. Basically, to give a little bit of a perspective, historically, an individual's residential status in India was determined only basis his physical presence and never on the basis of his citizenship under Income Tax Act. And as a resident, an individual was further classified as an ordinary resident or a not ordinary resident, again based on stay of that person in the preceding 10 years or so. Now, it's important to remember that tax basis in India is basis the residential status. So if a person is resident and ordinarily resident in India, then he is liable to tax in India on his entire global income. On the other hand, a person who is a resident but not ordinarily resident is taxable in India on India sourced income or any income which is received or deemed to be received in India. Now, additionally, if a not ordinary resident has a business or a profession outside India, but if such business or profession is set up or controlled from India, then even that income is taxable in India. The non-resident, on the other hand, is taxable only with respect to India sourced income or income which is received or deemed to be received in India. Now, over the years, the government felt, frankly, this may not be borne out by empirical studies, but the government perceived that there were situations where individuals were so arranging their affairs and especially their physical presence in India in such a way that that individual qualified as a non-resident in his home country as well as wherever he was based. So non-resident everywhere in the world. Such arrangements also allowed individuals to benefit from lower or nil tax rates in certain jurisdictions. So now what did they do? There were two changes. First, they curtailed the number of days that the person could visit India and yet protect his non-resident status. So, especially, and again, if they clarified this in response to a huge hue and cry which was raised, that if and only if the total income from Indian sources exceeded 15 lakhs of rupees, then the relaxation in the number of days permitted for such a non-resident to visit India and yet maintain her or his non-resident status was reduced to 120 days against 182 days earlier. So now basically instead of 6 months, it is 4 months. So therefore, if a individual is present in India between 120 days to 182 days, such individual would now become a not ordinary resident in India as against the earlier classification of a pure non-resident. Now, what they went on to specify is that if a citizen of India who is otherwise not liable to tax in any other country or territory by reason of their domicile, residence, or any other such criteria, and their income other than income from foreign sources, means indirectly Indian income, exceeded 15 lakhs of rupees, then that person will be deemed to be resident in India. Now, what this all means is that there is now a gray area, especially for those people who are resident in countries where otherwise there is no tax, and because there is no explicit clarification. But for example, let's say in the Middle East, there is a controversy and a belief that since there is no personal tax imposed in those countries, there is an exposure of qualifying as a deemed resident if you have this 15 lakhs limit. Income from Indian sources on which you are otherwise paying income tax. Now, frankly, to my mind, again, the better view is that that individual which is resident in, let's say, UAE especially, are not liable to pay tax basis a decree of that sovereign. And hence, they otherwise cannot be considered to be not liable to tax. And there was a very landmark AR ruling in M.A. Rafiq's case, which has held that. And then, of course, again, with these continuing, unhappiness being expressed, in a press release, I think, issued by the finance ministry, the finance minister also clarified that the new provision was not intended to tax those Indian citizens who are otherwise bona fide workers in other countries. Now, quite frankly, if you ask me, the most safe way in which this controversy can be avoided is, unfortunately and very unfortunately, if people restrict their stay in India to only 120 days in a financial year. Because otherwise there is so much interpretation that's going to come into play. Maybe there will most probably be litigation, because how do you define what is India sourced income? How do you define income which is otherwise controlled by a business in India or a profession set up in India? And again, the whole uncertainty has been created because there was a perception that some individuals were so arranging their affairs that they were paying tax nowhere in the world. Now again, this is a perception. Possibly there could have been some cases, but if there were such cases, you should have pursued them under your respective tax provisions, which anyway are so wide as to give you the power to look through and investigate. What have you done? Your pendulum has swung the other way. Now everybody is deemed. Now only the small relaxation of, if your income is less than 15 lakhs, we will not touch you. Again, I'm saying is an overreach, and we have still to see litigation on this point emerging. But I'm sure in the years going ahead, we will see many cases which will be litigated purely on this count.
Yeah. No, I think that is valid. I think that answers. Mr. Ashok Shetty is here as participant. He is from Los Angeles, California. I think his question was exactly on the whole stay bit, the whole NRI, OCI rules about the 120 days and the 179 days. So I'm hoping he got his answer from your statement, Hitesh Bhai. And while I have you, just one small question that I have is very pertinent one that we hear is that as an NRI, is it better to invest directly from a foreign bank account or transfer the funds to India to an NRE/NRO account and then invest from there? From an exit perspective, what is better? This is a common question that keeps coming and I don't have the answer.
No. So let me tell you, it's not as straightforward as the question appears to be, because it is nowhere found in any regulation, either FEMA or income tax. Now, where is this root of this question coming from? There were those cases in, let's say, before the rules were made much stringent, where there was this abuse of gifts coming in from overseas. Okay, and certain taxpayers took a call that since these were foreign remittances, you could not go into the source of those remittances, etc. You could not question, and three things were ideally questioned. First was, what was the relationship between the donor and the donee? Number two, what was the genuineness of this particular gift itself? And third, what was the capacity of the donor to give such a gift? So for example, did you get a gift of a huge amount of money from otherwise a carpenter, let's say, working in the Middle East on a fixed salary? Now, These were all questions which were debated at length some point in time ahead, in history of time, and where unfortunately the tribunal said that, look, if it came from a particular account, you had to explain the source, you had to clearly demonstrate that you are meeting these 3-4 criteria. Now post that, again, there was a practical challenge, because usually what used to happen, once, let's say, even genuine gifts came in directly from overseas, right, the assessments and the inquiries for these gifts would only start 2-3 years down the line. Now by that time, you are asked to produce bank statements and produce sources of income into that foreign bank account. Usually we found that many clients had a genuine difficulty of producing those old statements, and therefore we actually practically advise people that it is always better to open a non-resident external account in India. External, mind you, because non-resident external account
NRE
is
account.
freely repatriable, and number two, there is no income tax on the income, if at all, that you earn in that non-resident external account. Route your investment from there, and thereafter from the non-resident external account you are able to invest. Now that is another additional advantage, that your bank where your NRE account is opened also will have a record of the inward remittance which comes in, the conversion rate applied, the FIRCs they will be in a position to issue you even, let's say, a later point in time. Now all those are advantages which lean in favor of a non-resident external account rather than a pure foreign account, and that's been my practical advice to people. But let me hasten to say, it is not illegal if you invest directly from your foreign bank account. It's just that the onus of maintaining all the records, of answering all the questions, of answering the source from which that money came into that foreign account, you will still need to comply with maybe a few years down the line, and therefore you have to choose and weigh what is less inconvenient. Is it opening of the NRE account in India which is bothering people, or the process which is bothering people? And I know that banks also have cumbersome processes. It's not easy to open an NRE account that simply, as much as it is to open a foreign bank account by a non-resident. But yet I would think the balance of convenience, at least currently today, lies with that person opening an NRE account and routing his investments from the NRE account. I hope I have been comprehensive in
no, absolutely, very exhaustive, and I think the answer is very much there, and that helps the person who asked the question. So I'm going to quickly kind of pause here. We are at about 15 minutes to end the session, but let me just put some broad questions that I had in mind, and then some of them I'll try to capture from the audience as well. So there is this whole current inequality in the tax slab rates, and that is being much talked about, right? The listed companies, investors in listed companies pay only 15% on short term and 10% on long term. However, the taxation on startups or unlisted is higher. Obviously, you have the slab rate on short term and then 20% on long term. All three of you, probably one by one, Gautam, by you first. Do you think this is a valid tax slab rate, or should it undergo a change? Because I'm asking, saying that startups probably need to be better promoted, so investors in startups should be taxed less than those of listed. Is that do you concur with that opinion, or is there a different opinion? I would like to hear all the panelists one by one. Gautam, by you first.
Yeah. So let me take first shot. If you look at the capital gains rates, right, and when we speak to clients who are looking in India for the first time, until some time back, now the 0% has gone off. But assuming you had treaty protection, you had 0, 10, 15, 20, 30, and 40.
Exactly.
Right? All rates applicable to capital gains depending on type of investor, depending on period of holding, depending on intermediary through what you've invested, and depending on asset that you've invested. Real estate versus equity versus unlisted versus, right? So I think my thought is very clear on this. Don't use tax as the medium to create this level of complexity in tax, right? For financial investments, irrespective of the intermediary, just have simple 2 rates. If you want to promote holding for a certain period, that sounds logical, but just have 2 simple rates. So anyone coming in any investments in financial assets through an AIF, mutual fund, let's not give any of the intermediaries also an upper hand, any one of them, right? Put everybody on a level playing field. It should be the same as if I were investing directly. So that's
Absolutely.
my take on this.
Yes.
2 rates and be done with it.
Absolutely. Dinesh bhai, your take on this?
In principle, I would agree with what Gautam says. There are some complexities, however, which probably are historical in nature and will not go away. So take, for example, what is there under the tax treaties. So even though, for example, we have no longer any exemption under Mauritius and Singapore treaties, you still have the Dutch treaty, etc. And again, some of these are subsumed by the requirements for substance and poem and all of that. But even today, under the Dutch treaty, you could go away with a simple zero capital gains totally. The other thing is that maybe there is a thought process within the government, which is to say that a listed entity sort of deserves a preferential treatment compared to an unlisted entity. And which is what gives rise to long-term versus short-term, listed versus unlisted. But in principle, I would agree that we need to sort of, in fact, the government started to put the rates of slabs of everything in a narrow basket. Today, even for general corporate tax, we have a 15% rate for companies which are manufacturing and started after a particular date, and a 25% and a 35% and a tax holiday under SEZ, and same thing really applies to capital gains tax. It is a nightmare. It is very, very challenging. And more important, Yagnesh, when you go to the tax office to get a withholding certificate, the challenges that you face where just because of that possibility of multiple rates, somebody wants to say that on withholding level, you pay much higher and then you do whatever you need to do. So it's a real challenge, yes.
No, absolutely. Very well captured, Dinesh bhai. I think that's very relevant. Your take, Hitesh bhai, your turn.
I would think I have nothing more to add. I think the faster we bring down the rate of capital gains tax, because somewhere, there is one other, let's say, illusion in the minds of the regulators. And, again, I'm using that word illusion very, very, in a way, I struggle to find that word because I can use far more derogatory language. But illusion is that somewhere the capital gains is not earned income. And therefore, there must be a tax on it in some ways, and or like, this is something which we have the liberty to raise at whatever point in time. We have the liberty to, bring it down, give indexation in some issue, in some ways, not give indexation in some issue. I think if you ask me, frankly, venture investors work the hardest, to make their, you are in 100x VC, right? How many of your investments will give you that 100x? It's not free money, it's equity, which is the riskiest form of investment. If at all there is a case to completely abolish capital gains for all investors in, make it even notified startups. Let them invest and let 100 or 1 million startups bloom. That is the crying need of our country today. That's my.
I was actually hesitating to say this, Hitesh bhai, and you took the words out of my mouth that we are talking about, getting 200 unicorns in the country in 2-3 years, and we have a tax regime which is regressive in favor of the investors who are willing to, bet their hard-earned capital and put it in the highest, the riskiest of assets. So I think couldn't agree more with you. I'll just probably, stop here and ask Naveen, do we have time for more questions, or just want to check on the time?
You can go on for 10 more minutes, no problem.
Yeah. Okay. I have couple of questions. It's a little complicated, but I'll let Mr. S. Brian ask this question since he has put it. There are some 2-3 questions related to a frictionless investment under 3 scenarios. But I'll let Mr. S. Brian ask. If Mr. S. Brian, can you unmute yourself and ask the question? Or I can maybe ask for you.
Before that, can I take up one relevant question?
Please.
Which is directed to me. On investment through NRE account on exit, investors are not allowed to take INR in NRE account as banks are allowed to credit foreign currency only. No. Actually, there's a confusion here. So long as you have invested on a repatriable basis in a proper manner as prescribed under the FDI regulations of FEMA, there is no restriction on putting that money back into your non-resident external account. Yes, a non-resident external account cannot be otherwise funded except through monies channeled from overseas. However, if you have already invested in a FDI compliant manner on a repatriation basis, and all the compliances have been done by the company, it has been registered as a proper FDI compliant investment, then I don't see any problem. The bankers, if at all they have a challenge, can refer your matter to Reserve Bank of India, who I'm sure will approve their crediting these proceeds back to your NRE account. So I don't see any problem in the exit.
Yeah, I think Vipul, you got your answer, Vipul Mehta. Coming to S. Brian, please ask your question, Brian.
Yeah, hi, gentlemen. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Okay, excellent. So my question is pretty straightforward, and I was wondering if someone can throw some light on this. Given the current ground conditions, not what's likely to happen, etc., current ground conditions in India, is there some document or some expert that we can go to that can provide us a diligence checklist for the following three scenarios? One is an individual investing in an individual startup in India. So I'm talking about NRIs. Two, a US fund investing in a startup or a bunch of different startups with the explicit intention for commercial purposes to re-domicile those companies in the US. Right, because as you guys just indicated, there's a lot of advantages of doing that. And three, if a U.S. fund that wants to keep an allocation for either Indian individuals or Indian corporates to join the fund to invest in India and the U.S., is there someone that we can talk to try and get our these sort of scenarios sort of understood and understand what is the diligence items, what are the checklist items we need to be aware of?
If I can just come in on the externalization bit where you are saying that you want to make an investment with a view to ensuring that the overseas holding comes into play, I don't think there can be any single checklist at all, because every single situation is different. Let me give you a couple of examples. So you have an Indian company and say 80% of the shares are held by overseas venture capitalists or private equities, 20% held by Indian promoters, a very, very different scenario that emerges. A second could be a situation where there are two groups and you want to externalize. So every situation that I have ever dealt with on externalization of Indian companies is very, very fact specific, is something which really cannot have a template answer at all. And I don't think one can provide a set of regulations, and I can only tell you that can only confuse more than anything else, to say these are the regulations you need to be aware and alive to, ranging from anti-avoidance regulations in the tax laws to round tripping under FEMA to everything else, which become relevant in the context of externalization.
Hitesh, Bhai, Gautam, any one of you would like to respond to Brian?
No, I don't think that is possible. Frankly, it's not that straightforward that one can draw up a checklist and say, okay, individuals look at this checklist, for corporates look at this, for externalization look at this. This is not a flowchart kind of thing. Unfortunately, if I were to, I may have to start my own startup if I have to reduce it in the form of a checklist kind of thing. Because and remember again, Brian, what I mentioned is that every 12 months the ground will again change. So whatever I tell you today, even if I make up a checklist, and if let's say your funding takes you 12 months, you will have to come back to me to say, okay, hey, has anything changed? And chances are more likely than not, things would have changed. So I think if you have specific questions, you should consult the right experts with your specific point of view, and that can be customized to your requirements at that point in time. Mind you, it does not have a very long shelf life as well. So be cautious of that as well.
Yeah.
So who are the experts? Is there a specific group, or is that guys like KPMG, PwC, who are the people that can advise on, because it's got complex issues from taxation to FDI to repatriation. I mean, there's a whole bunch of complex issues. There's some startup formation issues. Is there a group or a set of companies that advise on this?
Yagnesh, you should answer that.
Well, yeah, Brian, I would simply say that it's a function of the amount of investment you're planning and the budget you have to spend on getting this advice. Because if it's a small amount you're trying to invest into startups, then probably the founders or the investor through who you're going probably is the right guy, and they typically know, because they, like people like us, like 100x VC, we have investors investing into our portfolio startups. So we know certain questions which are relevant for NRIs to invest, and that's exactly was the purpose of this seminar. And we kind of, the whole panel discussion to kind of try and simplify those things and make it as easy as possible. I would really love to see a tax regime which is so simple as Singapore, where there's no taxation, etc. But we are far away from that regime, and unfortunately, you have to deal with regulations, provision, and especially if you're an NRI, makes things a little more complex. If I was sitting in India investing into startups, it's pretty much the unlisted taxation that I have to see, and that's it. But unfortunately, the whole overseas investment and the inbound investments are fraught with uncertainties, as you would have already found out from the discussion today. But yes, I mean, that's my advice for you.
Yeah, the only thing, Brian, I'd like to add.
Yeah,
the only thing, Brian, I'd like to add is, if you've got an indicator set of facts, then you could have, a consultant who can throw up strawman structures, which will give you an idea of the direction. But again, as Yagnesh rightly put it, it'll be a function also of what's the quantum of investment that you're looking into.
Yeah. I would simply suggest, Brian, reach out to me. Naveen has my address, and we'll try to help you out, because that's what we do all the time. We invest in portfolio companies, and then we help investors address those investment related questions to the best of our knowledge. And we don't certainly charge fees at all. But if it's a complex problem, yes, you should be looking at a knowledgeable consultant who doesn't misguide you, because remember, well, those exit proceeds, when they come, the investment part is easy. The exit proceeds is the difficult one. That's the piece that you want to figure out from day one. And it's not easy, as Hitesh said.
Of course, that makes sense. No, thank you so much. That's very, very enlightening. Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, I think we are 1 minute away from the ending of the session. Naveen, let me know if there are any other questions that we've probably missed out. But I think given the time frame, we tried to cover most of the critical areas. But yeah, that's about the time we have, guys.
I think there's one more gentleman called Neeraj Polani who wants to ask a question. So,
Neeraj, why don't you, Neeraj, please ask your question. We do have a minute.
Yeah, thanks. So I am kind of reading this kind of new notification on sites like ClearTax and Tax Group. It seems accidentally ended up sending to Yagnesh only. So it says, as per new tax notification,
it's 8:30.
Sorry for that. Investors having net worth or INR 25 lakh in 3 financial years will get 100% tax exemption on the investments that are made up in the startups above fair market value. But when I'm reaching out to CAs or some experts, I'm not getting any clear insights on that. So I'm not sure if this is a new notification or if this was kind of in existence from some time and it's just that people started publishing it recently.
Hitesh bhai, you want to take this?
I'm sorry, I don't seem to have recalled any such exemption notification for investors. I don't know if Gautam or Dinesh, you have.
No.
Oh,
Yeah, but I think what Neeraj is mentioning is probably out there, and I tried to Google it and go to these ClearTax kind of sites, and there is a mention about some income tax notification whereby angel investors with this minimum net worth of 2 crores or average return income above more than 25 lakhs in the previous 3 financial years will be eligible for 100% tax exemption for investing in startups. Now, I don't know whether that was for returns or the investment itself. So that was the confusion. So that's what probably Neeraj is referring. But there is none.
There is an exemption of the income, but not for this. At least there is some confusion in what exemption is available to whom, whether it's to the investor or to the startup itself.
Yeah, he was mentioning about, the question was about whether the returns on the investment are tax-free for the angel investors or the investment value? That was the question.
I think we can look it up and revert, but I don't think
Yeah.
there's any answer.
There is nothing on the face of it. Okay.
Yeah. So
Neeraj,
multiple
we'll try to get back to you, Neeraj, on this.
Sure, thank you. Because I tried to dig in a lot and multiple links say the same thing. So I was like pretty much excited and happy about that. So, but I didn't get any concrete answers. So thank you.
Sure. All right. I think, guys, we are at the end of the session. I would like to thank all our panelists, Dinesh Bhai, Hitesh Bhai, and Gautam. Thanks so much for enlightening us, bringing some really high-level, policy-level kind of questions, answers, attempting to give your viewpoints, which sometimes is more important than the act itself. That's where we want to understand what trends. And can't thank you guys enough. Thanks for all the participants. Naveen, over to you.
Again, thank you all. This is a wonderful session. And for people who really have more in-depth questions, please feel free to write to us. We will direct the questions to all the three panelists and get you answers. Once again, thank you, Mr. Kanabar, Hitesh Bhai, and Mr. Gajaria. Thanks a ton. Please feel free. We would love to kind of tap on your shoulders again and have many more such sessions. If there's anything specific that you feel that you would like to host a session and educate people, please let us know. We'll be happy to put that together. And thanks, Yagnesh, for putting this together. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe.
Thank you, Naveen. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Good night.
Bye-bye, everyone. Stay safe.